This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to the Storyworks Roundtable. This week, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about story structure, Act 2. Part 2. We had an episode on story structure recently, and we went deep into Act 1. So we're going to start talking about Act 2 and maybe get all the way through Act 3 today. So not so much picking up where we left off as continuing the conversation about story structure. All right, so Act 2, it's the big chunk in the middle. It's roughly 50% of your book. Act 1 ends with that point of no return, that inciting incident. The character makes a choice, walks through that door into the journey, the main plot of your book. And there you go. There's Act 2. Take it from there.
Exactly. I feel like that
right?
has always been my problem is that you say Act 2, the main chunk of your book, where they head towards the climax.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sit here and go, well, great. So
now
what are they supposed to do?
I think the reason... Yeah, go on, sorry.
I just always feel like I run out of material halfway through Act 2. Where's the rest of Act 2?
The main reason for this, I reckon, is because we are drawn to write the story because we empathize or connect with or attach to our protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have an idea about this wonderful launch of the story, and then you think, I know how they're going to solve this. I know the ending. It's going to be freaking awesome.
Uh-huh.
And I think one of the things that's often banded around, and I think this is a great way to think about it, is that Act 2 is where the villain stars and drives the complications for the protagonist. And as authors, we live a lot more in the protagonist's mind than we do in the antagonist's. So you can sort of think, you run out of things. Okay, well, what more challenges have I got to have? And we're looking at it through the wrong eyes. We're looking at it through the protagonist's eyes. Whereas if we put ourselves back into the antagonist force and think, well, okay, what's making this hard to complete the story or for the protagonist to get what they want? So I think that's part of the reason why we hit that wall, because you think, okay, now, like you were saying, Kathryn, I've run out of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get to the end already. I can see it. It's got to play out this way. But of course, the reality is the protagonist doesn't know that yet. As I say, I think the reason is because that middle section is often much more about the interplay of complications rising because of the antagonist's deeds. Or things, or choices the protagonist make that that increase those antagonistic forces.
Right. Well, and it depends so much on the kind of story you're writing. Because if you're writing a white hat, black hat story, like a crime thriller, or, plenty of different genres, then that antagonist role is going to be paramount. But if you're writing a historical novel or a romance or something more character-driven, contemporary fiction, maybe you're dealing with a crisis situation and watching how it plays out in your characters' lives, like the inciting incident might be the death of a child, and then there is no true villain, right? So then we have to look at this in different ways depending on the kind of story you're writing. Is it about the antagonist-protagonist relationship, or what is it about that main body of your book with the rising stakes and tension up to the climax, to the peak of dramatic action there?
There's got to be something driving it, though, hasn't there? So whether it's a protagonist on the page and a very real force, or it's an internal force, where if it's a strong internal genre, where, like when we were talking about in the episode on fatal flaws, where there's something internally driving, gnawing away, eating away at the character, and as you say, could be maybe the death of a child is then presenting those problems. So I think it's, again, you've got to try and put yourself into that. okay, so why is this an antagonistic force? What is the conflict that I'm going to have to continually complicate?
Right, and the question to ask through every single chapter is, what does my protagonist stand to gain or lose?
Yeah.
What are the stakes here, and why do we care about them? So it might be that, the partner is going to walk out the door. That those could be huge stakes in a relationship-focused story. It might be that they're going to get fired from their job. So we can have some kind of villain-less events happen that can have massive stakes that play out in our protagonist's life.
Yep.
But it's always what will be won or lost that's going to now shift this story, that is going to force that protagonist into a new choice, a new action or reaction, that then elevates the plot arc again toward that climax.
I think too linearly when I think about Act 2. Like, I don't think about enough twists and turns and peaks and valleys type, image. I just think, what's the fastest way between 2 points? Which is kind of detrimental to building your Act 2, I think.
Right. Well, that's when you use the scene break or chapter break, Harry got on an airplane. 3 hours later, Harry got off an airplane. Okay, right. So the fastest way between 2 points is often poor storytelling. So
right, exactly.
Right. We need lots of twists and turns and evolutions and revolutions to get us through Act 2 in the most engaging, interesting way possible.
So when you're plotting Act 2, do you plot it from the beginning to the end, or do you plot it do you plot it linearly in terms of the way that events happen, or do you ever plot backwards? Like, how would you approach that?
Yes, I do both. Yes. So I plot key points linearly, things that I know I need to happen to get from the end of Act 1 to the opening of the climax. And then as I work, I have lots of ideas, lots of scenes I know I want to happen, and I'll write those and I'll have an idea of where they are. Like, I know if it's low stakes or high stakes, if it's going to be closer to Act 1 or closer to the climax. But then as the story takes shape, the building blocks can shift around as I start to see the connections and where they fit with the theme. And, is it better to put this before or after that main plot point? How is it going to help pull us forward and escalate things? So it's a combination. You need the linear sense of where you're going. And I would have key points on there, so in a full-length novel, you might have 5 key points that need to happen, but you're going to fill in 20 points around those. And those are much more movable as you work, and the subplots and the relationships are what really drive those other points.
Okay.
Yeah, also, I think it helps to think about you're trying to get from the end of Act 1 to the beginning of Act 3. And sometimes I know in my mind, I think I'm going from the end of Act 1 to the climax, because in your mind you think, okay, that's where my story is progressing to. Whereas really what you've got to try and do is drive some story forward to the inciting incident of Act 3. And that might help, because I think one of my fears is peaking too early, is putting climactic drama in the middle of the story. Right. And you think, no, I need to save that for the end. But then the moment you do that, you think, now I'm writing a really weak middle. Right. And so what do I do? But there are all sorts of other tools at our disposal. I mean, you can do twists and reversals, and you can put in coincidental, not too many of them, but coincidental plot twists, things that just happen, like stuff just happens in our lives, that then, drops into their lap, and it can make the story more interesting. And it is a bit tricky because you do feel a bit like you're writing into the dark in that middle section, even with plot points. because there's that need to, okay, I want to escalate the stakes. I want to keep the conflict rising. I want to keep the protagonist from attaining their goal, but not so slowly that the reader dies. or
let's hope
puts
not.
the book down. Puts the book down.
Yes.
And not so fast that all of a sudden, I haven't. The vicarious journey hasn't been sensational enough, so we get to a false ending that just feels flat, even though it might be all banging and crashing. So it is definitely one of those. It's the mark of what you do as a writer, I think, is how you treat that escalating story.
Right. Well, I think one of the main issues writers have with the soggy middle problem, with that kind of plateau, because you need the big bang for the climax, and you got going, and then it was like, oh, now what happens is that people focus so intently on the main plot line that they ignore their subplots and supporting characters, and that's to the detriment of the work as a whole. So those 5 or so events that I know need to happen, they concern my main plot to get from inciting incident to climax. We're going to have to go through certain things, certain conflicts to get us there. But all those movable pieces, what else is going on in your character's life around the main plot? Who is involved in your character's life? What choices does she have to make? What concerns does she have? And those are the things that complicate and enrich the main plot and keep us moving forward as we go up that plot arc. It's not, if it were a one-note story, it wouldn't be a novel. It would be a short story or a novella, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
But relationships, thematic content, concerns outside the main plot, that's what builds the stuff of a novel.
Yeah, as long as they serve to either increase the stakes or increase the conflict or make things more difficult along the way on the main plot. So you don't want to just have a subplot in the middle because you ran out of things. I know that's not what you were saying.
Right.
So it's like those sort of DNA threads, isn't it? You've got to weave it together in layers, which is tricky. And I think also in first draft you don't necessarily need to have all those things tied up, in revision. It's much easier to then go back and kind of sew up the little gaps that you might have left, and that I think is when the extraordinary nature of a story can come in. I can put this sequence in, and that will mean that they won't be able to be in the place they need to be in. That's what's going, and you kind of get the aha things,
right?
But it's when you're in that first draft thing and you've just launched your character into this main body of the story, and you think, right, now I've got 40,000 words to get to where I want to be for the climax. What's going to be there? And
right, well, that is the issue.
You can have sequences of things that go on, like you say, to do with the subplots. We can have choices that the character makes because of their fatal flaw that then launch them in the wrong direction. There's so many things that can happen as long as it's still not meandering, but zigzagging towards that climax. That's what keeps it really interested.
Right. Well, and it is the weaving together of elements that makes them subplots and not parallel plots.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
So you aren't telling separate parallel stories. You're telling one rich, interwoven story, because our lives are not singular in content. You've got a work life, a family life, hobbies, pets, whatever. And so the ways in which these things complicate and enrich each other, that's what makes a life, and that's what we care about. That's what makes a three-dimensional person and a three-dimensional character. So we've talked about Sherlock Holmes before as the arcless protagonist. He's kind of a one-note character. He's very predictable. We know exactly what his qualities are, and they don't change, right? But that's why we've got Watson, and Watson has Mary, And there's the human part of it where we get the subplots involved because we care about the richness of human life. So we need relationships, we need supporting characters, we need themes that tie everything together and keep us engaged on an emotional level, while the plot might engage us on an exciting level or an intellectual level, you know.
If we're all nodding,
yes, lots of nodding.
I have a next question, but I don't know if it's going to lead us in a different direction.
Go for it.
So, Robert, you mentioned that we're writing to the inciting incident of the third act. What is that? What is the inciting incident of the third act? Like, how would we define that, or how would we know what plot point that is?
Yeah, it's the point of no return that closes Act 2. So the point of no return that closes Act 1 is the choice the character makes. So it's a little different from the inciting incident. That is the event that occurs. The point of no return is when your protagonist is reacting to that event. And here's door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. He chooses the only choice he can make to lead us into your story, right? He walks through that door. We go through all the events of the main body of the book, of the main plot, and then there's some climactic moment that precedes the book's climax. So it's like another inciting incident. It's a big conflict, and it forces another choice on the protagonist. Okay? So point of no return number 2, the protagonist, it's his last chance to walk away from the climax. And he chooses to go through that door and enter the climax. So that's what ends Act 2. It's the choice that leads us directly into the climax. So, you know, if the hero's mentor is killed, that's the end, the event, sort of the inciting incident that leads into the climax at the end of Act 2. Now the hero must choose to face the foe alone because his mentor's gone. So does he pack up and walk away, or does he go through that door? He goes through that door, stands on his own. Climax.
Okay.
And it's often described as that moment where the character realizes what they have to do and why all the previous things they did failed. So there's a sort of a congregation of realizations, not necessarily conscious, but more labelled as more proactive. And it doesn't even mean that it's all going to be success and all downhill from there till the end, because there's, you know, you want the all is lost moments, or whatever you like to call it, or, you know, when they think everything is going to work, it doesn't. But it's, to me, it's that point where the character thinks, okay, and now I know what to do, and I have to do it, and it's down to me.
Right. And so part of that choice can involve a planning stage, right? Okay,
yes.
It's down to me. I accept that it's down to me. I know what I need to do. Now, how do I do it? Right? So that's that kind of preparation that builds anticipation for the climax. Yeah. So that culmination is a good word, Robert, at bringing the protagonist to that realization, that sense of self-awareness, and then that proactive choice, which is the walking through the door. I'm going forward.
That's true, isn't it? Yeah, it's in Act 1, you've got the door that it's the only door that will open, and they reluctantly dragged through it almost. It could be felt as if that's the case. Whereas that inciting incident of Act 3, it's the door that they're now knowingly going towards, even with trepidation, but knowing that that's what must be done. We're speaking very metaphorically, so it's a bit tricky, I suppose.
Well, it's a weighty choice, and it can either come with a sense of dread, deep responsibility, and deep ownership of this, like when the character has to go do something unpleasant to resolve the situation, like going into battle. they're both going into battle. But so I'm thinking of my historical book, Saving Annabelle, when Greta has that moment. She knows that she has to go free her sister through a mercy killing and confront her father who's been abusing her sister. So that is a deep responsibility full of dread that's morally very complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then to go to the other side of the coin, the choice or the moment can be weighty, but it can be ebullient. We can be joyful and excited to see the hero carry this out, like in Kung Fu Panda when he sees the blank scroll, and it's a gold scroll, so he just sees his reflection. It's momentarily puzzling. It's funny. And then he has his aha moment. He understands the key to everything is already in himself, right? And now he's like supercharged with energy. He's so excited because he knows he gets it. He finally got it. He's like giggling. He's so excited. So he's still going into battle to defeat a foe. But the feeling is the polar opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the moments have great weight, not necessarily in terms of mood, but in terms of impact. And we can approach the climax with dreadful responsibility or with, joyous anticipation or something,
Right.
But it's such a big moment. The spectrum between those isn't going to be that wide. It has to be big, whether a high or a low.
Yeah, when I'm reading a book that does that really well, it's when you get to that shivery, sort of, ooh, you can't wait to, and that's when it's well written, where you think I was going to put this down and go to sleep, but now I think I might just read on a bit, because I've talked about this before. One of my favorite things is when you get I didn't see that coming, and yeah, it still makes sense because the dominoes fall backwards to all the way back to the start of the book.
Right.
And which is where we can use all those other tools like the fatal flaw and the foreshadowing and all those things that we've talked about to make that culmination inciting incident of Act 3 just become a kind of gobsmacker in a way that you think, oh yeah, cool, oh right, okay, that's what's going to happen. That's deft work. And again, I'll say this again, it doesn't always come in first draft. You sometimes sew those pieces together better when you come back and revise. You might have the not the fully formed thought of it, but I agree. Yeah, the leader, it's one of those jaw-dropping moments.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily have to be panoramic, grand, spectacular. It could be a jaw-dropping moment inside the protagonist's head.
Exactly.
But it's definitely a big moment.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. Yes, whatever kind of realization it is, whether subtle and internal or in the midst of a fight scene, it's that turning point for the protagonist, where we no longer have a choice but to enter the climax. And that climax is, figuratively speaking, do or die. So the stakes might not be life or death, but
yes,
this is the crux of the whole story.
Yeah. Now we've got to take it to the conclusion. So I think that I find that helps me, Kathryn, in terms of sort of thinking about that middle part. Is I'm not bridging necessarily, launch of the story to end of story. I'm actually bridging, end of Act 1 to inciting incident of Act 3, and it kind of makes it seem like it's less of a giant chunk in my head. I've chunked it down. And then I can probably even chunk that down further and get to, here are the complications. This is some of the subplot. And I do what Alida does. I do those sort of major markers, including things we talked about before, like midpoint, if you feel like you want to have a midpoint shift in your story, or whatever other temp holes that we know, analogies that we use.
Do you really want to get a handle on the structure of story? Well, I've got a course for that, and appropriately enough, it's titled the structure of story. Head over to storyworksfiction.com, check it out, give it a preview, and sign up. Start your next great Storycraft adventure today. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.